Among other countries worldwide, anti-kleptocracy and corruption efforts stagnate in the Balkans, with human rights and democracy under assault. The Western Balkan states continue to struggle to control organized crime, as under-resourced institutions lack capacity or independence to tackle the problem. Turkey, Hungary, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Serbia received their worst corruption scores in 10 years in the latest Global Perceptions Corruption Index. The Corruption Perception Index ranks 180 countries and territories by their perceived levels of public sector corruption, and a scale of 0 from highly corrupt to 100 being transparent. In 2022, Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina have reached historic lows. Serbia ranked 36 and 34 for Bosnia. Political figures have a significant influence over the judiciary, which has damaged a number of critical organized crime cases. How can Balkan countries facing stagnation suppress corruption? And what support from the EU and NATO can effectively lead to progress? More on kleptocracy and corruption in the Balkans will be discussed with my colleague Harun Karčić, with his guest Andi Hoxhaj, professor at the UCL.
Dr. Andi Hoxhaj, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Now, after a short-lived honeymoon in the 1990s, we have witnessed a shift in the Western Balkans political leadership away from pursuing the rule of law and towards an authoritarian turn, while strengthening small circles of self-serving elites at the expense of citizenry at large. So is this a vicious circle of illiberalism and state capture?
The problem that the Western Balkans are facing quite in general, it's an ever-ending transition. So after the collapse of communism and the breakup of Yugoslavia, many of the Western Balkan countries were aspiring to become liberal democracies, very closely to those of the European Union, and the ambition was to join the European Union, which not only joined the EU as an entity, but also as a value and rule of law based societies. Now, the problem that the Balkans have encountered in the last 15 to 20 years, it's both a lack of internal reform within the Western Balkans and the EU lack of ambition in terms of enlarging and expanding the European Union in the Balkans. And what that has had an impact, it has an impact that it has slowed down the reform as well as the political pressure. And what we have at the moment in the Balkans is a lack of political leadership to actually put that forward. What is more concerning at the moment is that in the last 70 years, we have seen throughout the world a regress when it comes to liberal democracy norms, and the Freedom House report on Nation in Transition, which will come out in May, very recently gave a summary. We can see that for the last 17 years in the Balkans, we have not seen much of an improvement. But what is concerning is that now we also have other external powers such as China, Russia, and so on, where they are showing a different type of governments, which is more closely to authoritarian, and they see that as a model which can also provide some sort of economic growth. And the Balkans now are in that sort of period in which sort of shift that they want to take. But I'm sure we can elaborate a bit more on the other questions, because there are so many underlying issues that underpin this discussion.
Right. Despite astronomical expenditures by international organizations and governments alike to create a liberal democracy with a free market economy, Bosnia, Kosovo, North Macedonia, and Montenegro still struggle with high poverty, weak public institutions, low accountability, political instability, and high levels of corruption. How do we make sense of that? I mean, what went wrong, and why have other post-communist countries such as the Baltics been far more successful?
Well, first of all, one of the problems that we have is that after this breakup, we did not really push forward to have a capitalist system that is based on the rule of law, that is based on the market rules. But what we have is a crony capitalist system where there's a small circle of elites that feed the political leadership across the Western Balkans. And they, as you put it in the previous question, feed these vicious circles. When we compare it with the Baltic state, there were a number of things that they did quite differently to us in the Western Balkans. First of all, they empowered more the civil society, journalists, academia, and so forth, and they did share the stage with them, and they respected them, similar to the other rest of the European Union, their opinion, as well as the scrutiny that they provide. Furthermore, they managed to actually reform their own political parties as well as shift out some of the old leaderships. But what we have in the Western Balkans, we pretty much have leaders that are still around for the last 30 years. They have been in power, are in opposition, or want to come back. And that vicious circles and that lack of leadership within the Western Balkans are leading towards some of these challenges that we have. The Baltic also managed to have a more open and transparent government. But when we see at the Western Balkans, still to this very day, the Western Balkans are lacking transparency. And when we talk, for instance, about corrosive capital, we can see a number of investment in the Western Balkans lack complete transparency, as we have seen with many of the public procurement investment across the Balkan, or some of those that are funded by China, Russia, or the Middle Eastern countries. So Montenegro is one of those examples where we have seen the road that China has invested, where it was not transparency at all, or in Serbia, and so on and so on.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's no doubt that the Balkans have witnessed both constructive capital and corrosive capital, but how do we make sense of the fact that small states and transitional economies are particularly vulnerable to corrosive capital?
The problem that we have right now at the moment is that our old sort of reform was very closely linked to join the European Union, and that has been sort of the vehicle in terms of our internal reform. And what we have had in the past 20 years or so is that the EU would give certain ground in return that we will make certain structural reform. However, what we have seen more recently is China, Turkey, Russia, the Middle East countries also coming to the Western Balkans. And what they are doing is they're providing a similar kind of contract and procurement to help with the development of the Western Balkans. Now, the Western Balkan leaders do not really prefer the whole reforming and structuring which some of the World Bank, the European Union, and so on is asking. And they would prefer some of these other parties. And the reason here being is that because this small circle of elite, they would make the deals in a very non-transparent way. And that feeds to this vicious cycle. Now, the leadership is interested in this type of methods. And the reason being is because they want to maintain and keep in power. And that's why we have across the Western Balkans so many leaders that have been in power for more than a decade. And that is quite difficult to challenge and to combat. However, there are some steps that have been taken forward. So the US has this sanctioning regime. As we have seen, they have sanctioned a number of the Western Balkan leaders. Very recently, yesterday, the European Union is proposing to have a similar sanctioning regime. We have the UK and so on, which are now kind of putting their foot down and to try to make known to the Western Balkan leadership that their way of doing business is not anymore acceptable.
Mm-hmm. Now, every Balkan country has an anti-corruption agency. Why is it that anti-corruption agencies have failed so miserably in the region, except perhaps in Croatia? Why haven't they been able to prosecute high-ranking officials?
There are multiple reasons. First of all, when we look across the Western Balkans give very little budget to the anti-corruption agencies as well as to the judiciary. So on average, the Western Balkans do not pay more than $21 per capita, both the anti-corruption agencies and their judiciary. And when we compare it with the average European Union, it's $61, meaning the anti-corruption agencies do not have the sufficient resources and capacity to actually engage in proper investigation. So that is one problem that they have when we also compare it with the Baltic, which you mentioned before, or with Croatia, which is a bit more closer. The second is that these anti-corruption agencies, from the start where they've been set up, they've not been set up in a way that they can be truly independent. They've always been set up with certain limitations, right? And those have been to not go after political elites, but more to sort of combat corruption in a way that they can show statistically that they're doing something to fight it, but not really to do something in terms of truly reforming the Western Balkan countries. And that problem, we have seen it across. However, we have seen the European Union now taking a bit more of an approach in strengthening the rule of law and judiciary across the Western Balkans, as well as the anti-corruption, because they view that will be the only way forward. Now, the problem is if we do not have strong political will from the leadership across the Western Balkans to view that strengthening the judiciary and the anti-corruption agencies, it's a good and positive thing to transform, it will be quite difficult. And even the European Union, in one of its latest reports, found out that they have spent millions and millions of euros in the last 10 years in the Balkans, and there's not a lot they can show when it comes to fighting corruption. And the problem being is because there is not true political will within the Western Balkan leadership to address and combat corruption. It's mainly been sort of a lip service exercise. But having said that, we shall see moving forward.
Right. Speaking of foreign factors and kleptocracy, would you say that Balkan and international actors have underestimated the importance of China's and Russia's economic footprint, resulting in a failure to recognize the extent of the associated risks? I mean, has their ability to use FDI as a foreign policy tool been overlooked?
I mean, if we want to unpack this, sort of foreign interference or third actors, as many in the European Union call them, it is slightly different. So the European Union thinks that the Balkans have some sort of ideological link with either Russia, with either Turkey, the Middle East, or more closely now with China. Actually, it's not so much ideological, but it's more sort of a practical. So the Western Balkan leadership would prefer more to deal with these powers because they are less transparent and they are very forthcoming in terms of how they deal with public procurement and so on. However, it has been underestimated both the impact that Russia, Turkey, Middle East and so on, and now China have in the Western Balkans, because these countries have invested and have staked in major infrastructure sectors as well as in key sectors. So Russia has in gas, Turkey has in airline or telecommunication, China now is investing in roads. So therefore, there are key infrastructural and sectors which these countries have invested, and we have seen it with the war in Ukraine, how expensive it has become to buy gas. And we can see, how that is being played out throughout the Western Balkans. So that's been underestimated, and we can see the European Union now is trying to bring the Western Balkans more closely to their future arrangement in terms of where do they buy gas and resources, and that is to make it less dependent from these states. However, they've already invested in the last 10 years very heavily on these sectors, and so it will be quite difficult to challenge them.
Right. The practice of co-optation of local politicians is manifest and widely recognized in Serbia, where the SPS cultivated a long-standing relationship with Gazprom energy circles and the Russian political elite. Talk us through how exactly are extractive practices used to leverage political and economic influence?
So Gazprom and more generally the Russian energy companies have been very clever in a way that they've done business in the Western Balkans. And the majority of the companies that have business in the Western Balkans and strengthened it, they have always been behind and sort of put forward the Kremlin agenda in the region. Because energy, it's a crucial foreign policy which Russia has put forward. And in Serbia, it's one of those countries that it really manifests, as well as in northern Macedonia. Now, what they have done, specifically in the case of Serbia, they have heavily invested in these leaderships, and that is to maintain and support power. I mean, if we have a look and analyze the current situation, we can see after the war in Ukraine, the majority of leadership in the Western Balkans that are buying gas from Serbia, they were quite reluctant to put sanction or to align that sanction regime similarly to those of the European Union. And Serbia in particular is a standout, and that is because there are these close ties between the elite, the business elite, as well as the political elite, and they sort of feed one another. And that's sort of the challenge that we have. But having said that, there is a push in the European Union more generally to go for a green agenda, and that could be a major turning point to weaken the Russian influence in the Western Balkans through the energy sector. But it will take some time for these policies to achieve, because if we talk about this, so was a number of European countries being sort of very reliant to the gas and energy, and we could see Gazprom having a major impact in many of the political circles in the European Union.
Mm-hmm. And finally, I mean, I've come across a number of reports regarding the youth in Albania who demonstrate high levels of pessimism and a lack of trust in participatory processes. No doubt this is pretty much the case in other countries in the Western Balkans as well. Motivated by a scarcity of meritocracy and opportunities, many are deciding to vote with their feet. Does their detachment from political processes leave political leaders with little pressure to change?
Absolutely. I mean, Albania is having a similar experience to also a number of the Western Balkan countries have, where there is a brain drain and the youth is looking to migrate to the European Union. And we have seen it less and less, the youth being engaged in politics. And the reason being is that it's not anymore seen as an instrument that can change, or at least the change that they were hoping for, they are not seeing it. So in Albania, for example, in the last 30 years, the dream to join the European Union is seen as the end of the transition between communism and post-communism period. And now we are sort of entering to the fourth generation where they are still not viewing this transition to end. And many of the youth are sort of fed up with that situation, and are seen to take their destiny on their own hand, but not particularly to build that in the Western Balkans. And when we have a look at the majority of the barometers, and some which you were also alluding to it, when we see across the Western Balkans, the 3 to 4 main reasons, it's first is lack of work, second is lack of good health care, and third is lack of education or high level of corruption, which leads people to not have a meritocratic system in place where they could actually build those dreams and those development. So it's up to us, the rest of the Western Balkans, to kind of come together and to try to address this issue, because now we can see a 4th generation having similar challenge to those in the 90s. And a conversation has to be had there, how much the political leaders are willing to change and whether, they are willing to take the blame.
All right, Dr. Andi, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Years of ineffective action against corruption has allowed kleptocrats to undermine democratic processes and weaken public institutions, worsening conflict and instability in the Balkans. Recent reports reveal that Kosovo has made progress with an improved legal framework for political and election campaign finance. However, Crucial improvements are needed on the implementation of reforms and the need of government transparency to make progress. Foreign bilateral programs drawing funds to support anti-corruption reforms remain crucial. In the past decade, programs from the UK provided a total of $35 million to Bosnia and Herzegovina. Efforts externally and internally from the Balkans displays the willingness to tackle kleptocracy and corruption despite obstacles.